So first of all, welcome to the D365 F&O invoice automation process. What we're going to do today, before we do anything, I'm going to briefly introduce myself. My name is Ali. I'm a senior application consultant at a company called Signup Software, headquartered in Stockholm. And I've been working and specialized in the invoice automation process in D365 finance and operation. Today, before we jump on a hands-on demo, I'm going to present one slide showing you an overall process from a higher level, how it works from the time you receive the invoice until the invoice is finally posted in standard D365 and ready for payment. Looking at this schema, on the very left side, it says scanning data capture, and the prerequisite for invoice automation is capturing the data from the invoice. Regardless whether you receive the invoice as a hard copy, soft copy, electronic invoice, the invoice has to go through an OCR, optical character recognition, to capture the data on the invoice. We usually recommend having ReadSoft as an application. We do the implementation as well as Signup, but you're not forced to have ReadSoft. You can have your own third-party OCR application as long as it generates the formats that are required by ExFlow to process the invoice. Once the invoice is scanned, two file types are generated: an XML file containing the data that is scanned from the invoice and a PDF file having an image of the invoice. Once those files are generated through an API communication between ReadSoft and ExFlow, a batch job would run, pick up all those invoices and bring them inside D365, inside ExFlow, which is built inside D365. And the first form where they will land in is called the import form. In the import form, ExFlow will automatically code the invoice based on a very smart feature called posting proposal, minimizing the manual work of any AP person. Once the invoice goes in, it's going to be automatically coded, and it's very important to know that ExFlow is using the invoice register process in standard D365 to process the invoices. So it comes in, the invoice will be registered, and it moves to another form called document form. If the invoice requires approval, it's going to be sent out for approval based on the workflows and suggested approvers that you build in the workflows. We do support position hierarchies. We do support any condition to send the invoice out for approval. It's also important to know that the engine that ExFlow uses is way better than the one that you have in standard D365. It's very instant that it sends the invoice out for approval the moment the invoice is registered. And it's also flexible. It also checks that there is no approvers missing from the invoice, even though it would also adjust the approval route based on the updated data. So once the invoice is approved, another batch job would run, pick up all the approved invoices, and finally post them to standard D365. In that part, I also need to mention that we also support the purchase order invoices. ExFlow will also adapt to all the parameters in standard D365, whether you're using three-way matching, two-way matching, invoice total matching, price variances, price tolerances, charges tolerances. All the parameters in standard D365 are fully supported by ExFlow. Not to forget to mention that ExFlow will also give you more flexibility by adding more parameters to the application that would give you more flexibility than standard D365 would. And of course, after final posting and payment, we have a workspace for analytics, showing you some visualizations, showing the performance of your approvers, your AP, and even your suppliers, showing you which are the worst suppliers when it comes to matching the invoice and which are the best suppliers when it comes to matching the invoice. Now that we've gone through this slide, I'm going to go and jump into the most interesting part, talking about the ExFlow inside D365. I'm going to refresh my page. Okay. Now that we are inside D365, just to verify what I've said earlier, ExFlow is like any other module inside D365. It feels and looks the same, and it's very easy to learn. If you are familiar with D365, ExFlow is using the same interface. It looks and feels the same. People who would easily adapt to it. So the two main forms that I will be talking about today are the import form as well as the document form. Import form is where the invoices reside as soon as they are fetched from the scanning application inside D365. The document form is the form where the invoices would move to after they have been registered in D365. Just before I go inside, I just want you to know that there is pre-filtered menu in here. So you could see cost invoices in the import form, purchase order invoices in the import form, or all invoices, regardless of whether they are cost or purchase order invoices. Same goes for the document form. You also have a pre-filtered forms, so you can also access the document form with the view of cost invoices only or purchase order invoices only, or you would want to see all the invoices in the document form. Let's start with the import form. Once I go click on import form all, I'm going to get the list of all the invoices. And what is really cool about it is that you could see which company those invoices belong to. One feature that is super nice is the fact that you could see all the invoices cross company, especially the invoices or the companies you have access to. So if I click on cross company, show all companies, I'd be able to see the invoices in all the legal entities that I have access to. And then of course, I don't need to move from one company to another to basically handle those invoices. From one legal entity, I can handle all the invoices in all the legal entity I have access to. So now if I look at this form, just below it, I have header information about the invoice showing the company ID, which is basically the company receiving this invoice, the user ID, and that's very important because before you edit any invoice, you need to take it, making sure that there's only one AP person editing the invoice at a time. Moving to the right side, you would see further header information of the invoice, such as the invoice number. If you have a purchase order invoice, you would see the purchase order number and much more the more you scroll to the right side. Just below it, you would see the respective lines of the invoice. Of course, if you have a cost invoice, the line type will be either a ledger type, a fixed asset, or a project. If you have a purchase order invoice, the line will automatically shift from ledger or project or fixed asset to item. And this is how you distinguish between a purchase order invoice and the cost invoice. It's basically by the line type, and if you have a purchase order number scanned from the invoice. Second thing before we move further, and I think it's one of the important things that the AP person would look at, is how we display the invoice image. There's two different ways to display the invoice image when it comes to ExFlow. The first one, as you see on this browsing session, we have a side-by-side showing 50% invoice image and 50% invoice data. This was initially introduced by Microsoft in a version called 8.1 of D365 Finance and Operations, and it's not as flexible as an ExFlow because it split the screen into 50% invoice data, 50% invoice image, but doesn't give you flexibility. In ExFlow, you have the ability as an AP person to minimize the invoice image if you don't want to see it in big scale. And you can expand it by just moving it to the left side to see a bigger scale of the invoice image. That's one way of seeing it. Of course, if you don't want to see the invoice image in the grid list, it's very easy. All you have to do is just click on General and hide side by side, and then it would disappear. The other option to see the invoice image is basically by clicking Show Invoice, and you will have a bigger scale of the invoice image. Now, AP persons, they usually prefer to have two screens, one screen to view the invoice image and one screen to see the invoice data. I'm going to pretend that I have two screens over here. I'm going to open this invoice image in a new window. Now I have a separate browsing session for the invoice image, and now I'm going to alter from one invoice to another. And you would see, regardless of the fact that I'm working in two separate sessions, the respective invoice image is updating accordingly. Good. Not to forget to mention, due to my time frame, we will have to process only two invoices in this session, one cost invoice and one purchase order invoice. The focus is going to be on the automation part of ExFlow. Of course, if you would like to have further information, feel free to reach out to me or to be my colleague, and we will organize a full demo of ExFlow. But let's continue with this. I'm gonna have the first invoice over here. It's a cost invoice. As you see, we have the header information on top, the line information below. As I mentioned before, when I was talking about the overview of ExFlow, there is a very smart feature in ExFlow that would automatically code the invoice without any human interaction. If we look at this invoice, we have the main account, the business unit, financial dimensions automatically coded, and the lines were split into 3 lines without me doing anything in this form. So the invoice was automatically coded and the approvers were automatically suggested based on the workflow and the position hierarchy in standard D365. Now, if I go and edit this invoice, of course, I'm able to see further information on the header, detailed information, who is the supplier, what is the invoice number, the voucher in standard D365, the posting profile, and the terms of payment, and all the dates, the transaction dates that are required for processing an invoice. Same goes to the amount and further information to the right side. Below it, you have the lines. And at the very bottom, you have the respective coding of each selected line. You also have a tab for approvers. As I said, approvers will be suggested based on the workflows and the position hierarchies that are configured in the standard D365. Now, what I'm going to do is basically register this invoice. But before I do this, I'm going to copy the invoice number so we do a follow-up on this invoice in the document form. So I'm going to hit General and Post. Keep in mind that this process will not be done manually. There will be a batch job running in the background and registering all the valid invoices from import form, moving them to the document form. Now, let's have a look at the message that we've got over here. It says invoice number 13579 was automatically approved according to a purchase agreement 135. As you know, this was a cost invoice. The invoice was automatically approved since it matched an agreement. What is an agreement? The agreement form was introduced to bypass the approval process if you have a contract between you and your supplier. That is one of the main reasons we have it. So you go to a form called agreements where you can define the criteria under which a cost invoice can get automatically approved without any human interaction. Now, the other reason to use the agreement form is the acceptable usage policy. A very famous example about the acceptable usage policy is what we do at SignUp. All our consultants, they get their mobile phone bills paid by the company. As long as the invoice does not exceed 500 euros, they don't want to waste the time of the consultant as well as his manager looking at an invoice that is within the acceptable usage policy. And there you basically could define many policies in your company. I mean, as long as the electricity bill does not exceed 300 euros, as long as the rent bill does not exceed $500, you don't want to spend time looking at those invoices. They are within the policy that you have defined in the agreement form. So now if you think about the cost invoice, let's just verify that in the document form, the invoice was approved. So if we go to ExFlow, document form all, and then we're going to search by invoice status approved. But before I do this, I just want you to know that the document form is the main form to find all the invoices and trace all the invoices that have been registered from the import form, sent out for approval, or finally posted. So if we go invoice status and search by approved invoices, and then I apply a filter like any form in standard D365, search for the invoice, I could find that this invoice has been automatically approved. If we look at the lines, if we scroll to the very right side of the lines, it shows a comment saying that the invoice was automatically approved based on the agreement number 135. So you have full traceability. Why was this invoice automatically approved? Now, the final stage for a cost invoice is basically posting it to standard D365. Keep in mind, ExFlow is using standard D365 in the background, the invoice register process. So now, since we're demoing this, and I would like to show you that ExFlow is posting to standard D365, I'm not going to run the batch. I'm going to do it manually. I'm going to go to accounts payable form. And let's collapse all, search for invoices, and I'm going to go for invoice approval. Now, if I click new, select invoice approval lines, then find vouchers. Here's the invoice that I have got approved in ExFlow. So the 3 lines and all the header information of this invoice will be automatically fetched into standard D365 invoice approval journal and will be finally posted to standard D365. If I hit the post key now, the invoice will be posted. Very important that a batch job will do this for you. So the posting process will be handled by a batch job that would run in the document form, fetch all the approved invoices, and finally post them to standard D365. Now, this invoice has been posted. If we go back to the document form, the status of the invoice should change from approved to invoiced. Now, if you think about the cost invoices from a general perspective, the invoice is going to come in. It's going to land inside the import form. It's going to be automatically coded with no manual interference. Once the invoice is registered, it's going to be moved from import to document form. And if there is an agreement, the invoice will be automatically approved. The invoice will be picked up by a batch job and finally posted in standard D365 with literally no human interaction. Good. Now, before I move on to the next invoice, there's 2 things that I want to talk about when it comes to cost invoice, which is first thing is the traceability between standard D365 and ExFlow. Now that we've posted the invoice to standard D365, anywhere you have any posting coming from ExFlow, you will find the famous ExFlow key on top of the form. So here we are in the invoice approval form in standard D365, and we could see the ExFlow key on top. You can click on the ExFlow key and say, show me the invoice image. And here you go, you have a proper scale of the invoice image. Not only this, you can click on the ExFlow, take me to the document where those vouchers are initiating from. And here we go back with a pre-filtered view of the invoice in the document form, showing you the invoice that have caused this ledger posting in standard D365. Good. So the second part that I want to talk about before I move on to the purchase order invoice is basically reserving your cost at month end, which is a very cool feature in ExFlow, and it's one of the key selling points of ExFlow. Reserving cost at companies would take usually somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how many invoices they process on a monthly basis. But if you're using ExFlow, reserving your cost would literally take few seconds to generate, few hours to adjust as an AP person and do the final posting. Let's do this together and see how simple and how friendly it is to generate the reservation of cost at month end when using ExFlow. All you have to do is basically go to ExFlow and then under periodic tasks, post, accruals, create journal for accruals of estimated cost. It's very important to know that ExFlow will not post anything to standard D365 when it comes to reserving cost. It's only preparing the journal for you. So you specify the date range from date to date. What is the posting date? It should be the last day of the month, let's say 31st of May, and the reversal date should be the 1st of June. Now I hit the OK key. And ExFlow will automatically create the cost reservation in standard D365 in a general journal numbered 1873. Let's go to General Ledger. We go to Journals, General Journals, and try to search for the cost reservation created by ExFlow. It's the one in the bottom. Now I'm going to click on Lines. And you would recognize that ExFlow has fetched all the cost lines from the active cost invoices into this form with all the information. As you can see, the posting date is 31st of May, and the reversal date should be 1st of June. All the information from the lines of the invoices will be automatically fetched from the invoice to that form. Looking at the main accounts, the coding, all this information would be visible for you. Keep in mind, ExFlow does not post anything in this process. We just prepare it for the AP person. They have the full privilege to do any adjustment before they finally post this to standard D365. That's basically all what I want to cover regarding the cost invoices. Now I can jump into the purchase order invoice process. Let's go back to the import form. It's going to be a similar process to what we've done. So we go back to ExFlow invoices, import, and import form all. So now that we're going to start with the purchase order invoice process, it's going to be very simple, similar to the cost invoice process. The only difference that you would recognize is the fact that we have a purchase order number scanned from the invoice, and the line type would change from ledger to item. You have all the header information similar to the cost invoice. The more you scroll to the right side, you would see further information on the header. Same goes to the line information. You could see all the line information just below. Also very important to know that we can connect the items, the scanned items to the purchase order if you have similar naming between the suppliers and what you have in the database. We also use the external item description in standard D365. So if your supplier has different namings to the items than you have in your system, whatever you define in the external item number, ExFlow will use to connect those lines together. So Now you have on the line level, we have further information about the invoice lines. We have a pretty cool feature that you're able to see the matching result in the import form, whether you have a price variance, quantity variance, total invoice variance, whatever the variance is, you will have visibility on the variance as an AP person before the invoice goes out for approval. You have, of course, further information the more you scroll to the right side, such as the purchase quantity, the unit price, the amount on the lines, and you could even see the suggested approvers on each line. Now, of course, you can edit the invoice to see further information about this invoice. It's going to be similar to the cost, so it's not going to be confusing. Very simple header information here, the line information just below, and all the details next to it. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to register this invoice. Keep in mind that the matching result of these two lines says matched, and that means there is no variance, and we are expecting that as soon as we register this invoice, the invoice will be automatically approved with no human interaction. So before I do this, I'm going to copy the invoice number so that we trace this in the document form. I'm going to click on General, hit the post key. Keep in mind there is a badge that would do this for you. And once the invoice is registered, it moves from the import form to the document form. Let's see the message we've got. It says, this was the last line to be approved, and that means it required no human interaction to get this invoice approved. Since there is no variance on this invoice, there is no price variance, no quantity variance, no variance at all, the invoice will be automatically approved. Let's do a quick follow-up in the document form to see what is the status of the invoice. We go in here, search by approved, search by the invoice number similar to any form in standard D365. And here we've got the invoice with status approved. And that means the invoice required no human interaction or no manual interference to get it approved. Now, the final stage is basically posting this to standard D365, and that's very easy. When it comes to the purchase order invoice, you're able to do this from the document form. So if I hit the edit key, of course, you don't have to do it this way. This is the manual way of doing it. The batch job will be picking up all the approved purchase order invoices and finally posting them to standard D365. The only reason I'm doing this manually is just to prove that we're posting in standard D365 and nowhere else. So I'm going to hit the post key. And as soon as I do it, I will be redirected to standard D365 PO posting form. So now I'm outside ExFlow, I'm in standard D365 with all the information fed into standard D365. As soon as I hit the post key, the invoice will be posted and the status of the purchase order will be updated. Good. So now this has been posted. Let's go to the purchase order in standard D365. You would recognize that the status of the purchase order has been updated to invoiced. Let's go and have a look at the invoices from inside D365 just to prove that you have full traceability between ExFlow and D365. So if I click on the invoice journal, automatically it would open up. And of course, anywhere ExFlow is posting, you will find the ExFlow famous key. So click on it and say, show me the invoice image. I just want to see the invoice image in a proper scale to see what is going on in here. Or take me to the document form where the journals have initiated from. A pre-filtered view, very useful, very helpful to see all the details of the invoice in the document form before it was posted to standard D365. Now, keep in mind, after posting, the status of this invoice has also been changed from approved to invoiced. That was basically everything I wanted to cover in this demo. I know I had a short time frame, but again, I want to remind you that if you want further information about invoice automation process, feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Toby, and we'll do our best to organize a full demo where we show you a full details and scenarios of what happens once you have any variance on the invoice and how you could approve your invoice using your mobile phone. Thank you so much and have a good day.